Welcome back, everyone. I hope you grabbed a cup of coffee or you had lunch. And the next presentation is by Transport for London. The speaker is Becky Upfold, who has well over 20 years of experience in sustainable transport in Canada and the UK. And Becky currently works for the Transport Innovation Directorate, evaluating and testing the potential for DRT, e-scooters, and other new business models to affect or complement TfL's objectives, operations, and customers. And just to give a bit of a background here, so TfL did a couple of large DRT trials in suburban London back in, I think they were, Becky is going to give us all the details. And if you don't know about these schemes, there has been an assessment of these schemes. It's online. I'll try and find the link, and I will share it in the text box. And because it's really worth reading that assessment, it's what pushed me to get in touch with TfL and ask for somebody to present in this event. That assessment is great. I highly recommend everybody to read it. And just to summarize what we have next, after Becky, we have a presentation by Hertfordshire County Council. Alice Bowler is the speaker, and then we have two short presentations by DRT app suppliers. It's Via and Right Tandem. So yeah, over to you, Becky, now.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm just going to, let me just see if I can get this tech working. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, looks like it. Okay.
We can see that here, you lovely, thank you.
Excellent, okay. Well, thanks for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to come and present, because as you said, we've got the findings of our report on our website, but we haven't really had much of a chance to speak in this COVID world and share the findings from the trial. So thanks. And as you said, I'm from the Transport Innovation team at Transport for London. The findings of this trial are credit to so many people and the partnerships that we built with ViaVan and with RATP and others, which we will talk about in a bit. And I particularly wanted to give a shout out to John Colgan, who managed those partnerships and the day-to-day runnings with them from Transport for London, and Amy Vaughan, who put together all the findings and the analysis and is responsible for that report on our website. So just to tell you a little bit about the trials, I guess what's the background to them, some of you may know, but it's worth explaining a little bit about the Transport Innovation Directorate at Transport for London to help you sort of understand. And I guess our directorate is there to keep Transport for London planning and prepared for the future. And we're particularly interested in sort of harnessing the best of technology and the best new business models to help with TfL's biggest challenges. And back in 2017-18, we were seeing a lot of industry interest in demand responsive vehicles. We had applications of demand responsive bus transport services through our London service permit, people who wanted to operate these services in inner London. And inner London's where we've already got a good public transport system. So we were interested really in how we can harness this expertise, this customer-facing app-based route optimization service for our biggest challenge, which is in outer London. And in outer London, we have still car dependency, and it's more difficult to provide conventional public transport. So, and we have a really difficult mode shift target to reach in London. We need 80% of all trips in London to be by walking, cycling, and public transport by 2041. So we wanted to see, can this new business model help with that big challenge in areas of outer London where it's more difficult to provide conventional public transport? So it's a marriage of private and public goals. And it was very much a marriage through the procurement too. So we did a competitive procurement process for a cost sharing approach where Transport for London was setting standards that are important to TfL and the Mayor. So things like driver pay and benefits needed to be the same. We needed to make sure the vehicle was accessible and clean, but we made space in the contract for the industry and the private sector to bring their expertise to determine what the look and feel should be, what the vehicle should be, what the pricing should be, and how to optimize that technology. So there were some fundamental things that were not changed through the trial. So we did have to make sure that we didn't make any changes to other bus services. These trials had to complement the existing public transport. We didn't integrate with Oyster, because that's too difficult to do with the timelines. And we did have to make sure that Freedom Pass holders continued their concessions, so it was free for older people and disabled people to use the service. So there were two trials, Go Sutton, which was launched by Veervan in May 2019 with their bus operator partner Go Ahead. And then Slide Ealing was launched in November 2019 by RATP, the bus operator, in partnership with their tech provider Moya. So already there was a difference there in the lead partner from technology in Go Sutton, technology provider leading and bus operator leading at Slide Ealing. And they also obviously operating in totally different geographical areas, and they had different operating hours, and they were using a slightly different sized vehicle each with a different wheelchair accessibility. The similarities though, they started off using the same fare, and the service area was approximately the same size. So as it said on that last slide, we did have to unfortunately stop the trials earlier than expected because of COVID. And in line with government regulations, we had to close those down. So there were things that we couldn't test, that we still wanted to test, which I'll talk about a bit. And unfortunately, some of the surveys that we had planned weren't able to happen. So some of the research you'll hear today is limited to what we heard from the Go Sutton survey. But we had a number of learning objectives, but I'm going to split today's presentation into what we learned about the customer offering, what we learned about the impact on city for London, and what we learned commercially. So firstly, what did the customers think about this service and the technology? Well, amongst those that used it, satisfaction was really high, and we got lots of positive feedback from Sutton community in particular, and particularly amongst Freedom Pass holders. And some of the things they really liked about it, the attributes they rated sort of most highly in the surveys, were its cleanliness, safety and security, and the driver attitude. And there was with the driver a real engagement with these services, because it was a bit of a personal service. You got to know the driver. Some things about the service that were a little bit more confusing at times were confusion about the shared ride, or whether it was a door-to-door, and how the virtual bus stops worked. But those you could sort of mostly get used to. Overall awareness was high amongst the boroughs, so about 3/4 of Sutton Borough was aware of the service. But the thing here really is that take-up was low. When you looked at the overall population, only a small percentage of the population were using these services. So next, what about the app? Well, when we went into this, we actually thought the app was going to be quite a barrier to use. We were concerned about that, particularly amongst older people. So we set a requirement actually that there had to be an alternative way of accessing this. We were really surprised, therefore, and it's a really key learning for Transport for London, that 83% of Freedom Pass holders, which are mostly older people, in Go Sutton service, and 98% for Slide Ealing, those bookings were made through the app. So that was a really big surprise and a really good learning. And the phone booking that was provided was not well used. It was quite costly to deliver. And obviously didn't provide the same quality of service as the app did, because you couldn't provide real-time updates. The other thing on the app is sort of just, well, about the technology really, is the power of the technology to optimize and customize the route. It was really interesting to work with our private partners here and see how they did the route optimization and how they could customize it to local restrictions. So say there was a speed bump which was having a bit of wear and tear on the vehicle, they could make sure that in the routing they could avoid things like that. And we could see very quickly, as soon as we started these trials, how the power of this technology could help improve our own on-demand services at Transport for London, Dial-A-Ride. And so we worked quickly to see what we could learn for those services. And the tech also, there's a really interesting case study of the tech, because when we had to close the trials due to COVID, we looked at how we could redeploy the vehicles and how we could redeploy the technology. And there was a use case, and it was really exciting at the time to see that we could use the tech to for London Council to deliver emergency food supplies in the first lockdown. So what the app did was it took the list of drivers and deliveries and assigned a route that sort of maximised those volunteers' hours, maximised efficiency, and got those food parcels delivered as quickly as possible. Secondly, what did we learn about the city? Could it provide a cleaner, healthier, and more accessible London, and help with that challenge in outer London of mode shift and reducing car dependency and congestion? Well, overall, the service definitely improved access in the area for those in that service area. So for those of you interested in public transport accessibility levels, that was increased through the provision of this service for more direct and quicker journeys. And we did see mode shift, and I think everybody listening right now is aware of just how difficult it is to get mode shift from car users. So 29% of Go Sutton users would have otherwise taken a car or a taxi, and that was a really big number. However, a bigger number, 57% of respondents, did switch from buses, be it 1 or 2 routes. We also couldn't get the volume of trips. As I've said, there was low take up. And I think that qualitative research that we did in Go Sutton here helped to show that the perceptions were a bit of a barrier to use here. So some people felt that it looked like community transport or hospital transport and weren't quite sure whether it was for them. And clearly, obviously, there's always a group of people for whom will not shift from their own private car use. It's difficult to shift behaviours. When you look at the impact on London streets, it was safe and clutter-free due to the virtual bus stops. But I guess there was a bit more of a supply of seats than there was demand. So the number of shared rides on the service was 36% for Slide Ealing. 56% of trips were shared on Go Sutton. And overall, I guess that proportion of shared rides and the empty mileage, which was 50%, meant that we couldn't be certain we were reducing congestion in the area or improving air quality. And lastly, commercial. I realise I need to move on for time. So clearly, there's a lot of things on the commercial side that we can't disclose working with our private partners. But what can we tell you? On the pricing side, customers rated the price of the fare good value for money. And it was really interesting to see how the change in fare in real time, you could see really how that helped to grow the customer base. So a decrease in price grew the customer base, and then you could see that at the right time, you can then increase the price again to grow revenues. And when you look at what the costs are, like other buses, people costs are a big chunk of the money. And actually with the people, you get good value for money here because the drivers are a real sort of face of the service. And they can do a bit of the marketing for you. One of the costs that's not like buses, unique to this demand responsive buses, was the platform development costs. So you've got to develop the apps. Obviously, you've got to maintain them and host them. And I guess there are things definitely here that we ran out of time to do. So this is where we really wanted to do a bit more testing. So our private partners wanted to test how we could reduce that empty mileage, how we could reduce the cost of the call centre, which are obviously a big cost here, and whether by connecting to a big public transport hub like Croydon or Morden, we might be able to increase those customer levels. But when we did try and model those scenarios, when we did model them, we found that even once you've got an established service and tested those scenarios, it wasn't going to be cheaper to run than our existing bus subsidies. It was, however, considerably cheaper than our dial-a-ride services, which are not like for like because they're door-to-door, not virtual stop to virtual stop, but we were aware that there's definitely opportunity to reduce costs through this technology there. And I think what we were really clear on through this trial was the power of information here. It was really interesting to see, working with our private partners, how you can, all this information coming in through the apps, you can see it all, and you've got all the levers you need to sort of test and hone it so that you get the best optimized service. So I said at the beginning I would talk about the customer, the city, and the commercial findings of this trial. So on the customer front, just to summarize, we saw really high satisfaction amongst those that used it. The app worked well, but overall, I guess we saw that the take-up was low, and there was some perceptions were a bit of a barrier to use. On the city side, we saw that there was really good mode shift from car, but there was a greater proportion coming from bus, and we couldn't be certain those services were reducing congestion and improving air quality. And within the constraints that were put on this service, and remember back at the beginning, I said that we didn't change any other bus routes. We had to accept the Freedom Pass, had to be an area of outer London, and we had to meet those standards. These services were not cheaper to run than our conventional buses, but we did see the power of that technology to make other on-demand services more cost effective. I think overall, it was been a fantastic learning opportunity for Transport for London to work very closely with private partners. And we've learned so much from that experience that maybe that's a presentation for another day. And in the meantime, I think we're going to send out the link so that you can read a little bit more in the report that's on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. I love this presentation for all the good insights it provides, and working in the DRT sector, I've used a lot of these insights in our day-to-day job. So thank you very much for the presentation and all the good things that TfL is doing in this field. And we have a couple of questions. So the first question is the lack of integration with the Oyster card system. It seems to be an omission. So do TfL know how much this would have influenced the uptake of the DRT trial?
Difficult to say, but I guess ultimately it's a really difficult thing to integrate with Oyster, and not something we could have done within the confines of this trial. We did see, though, that journeys connecting to other public transport were low. So I think there were about 10% that were connecting to other forms of transport. Obviously, that might have been affected by the integration of Oyster, that it was low, but we saw that a lot of the trips were for local use.
Very interesting. The next question is, in Essex, the main DRT operator did not suspend any DRT services due to COVID, but actually they ramped up services to take on NHS work, food deliveries, and generally just the services were repurposed to deal with COVID, the COVID response. So do you see the value of DRT's flexibility in these kind of areas, especially emergency planning, social inclusion, and the difficult question is how one can put a social benefit value on this? Yeah, I know it's a tricky question.
That's a lot in a question. Well, as I said, when we closed the services due to COVID, we did need to close them due to government guidance and TfL's approach, and because of the social distancing on these small vehicles was not considered appropriate. It wasn't appropriate. So there wasn't sufficient social distancing. But we did totally look for those opportunities to repurpose, and it was a really interesting find to redeploy these services for emergency food parcels, just as you just said, has been done elsewhere. And I think that was an exciting project to work on. I think Vivian, who led that, would probably say it was a lot of work as well. But it was a busy time for everyone, wasn't it? And as to the community transport, yes, I think that's where we see the opportunity for this, is that there are, when you think of all, I think we were in Sutton, and there were other community vehicles on the streets, be it outside libraries or health centres, and you did think if you could consolidate those services through this technology, that could be a chance to really reduce kilometres and congestion in the area.
Thank you very much, Becky, and I have shared the link to the document you referred to in the text box. And yes, our next speaker. Moving on to our next speaker, it's Alice Bowler. Alice is the project manager within the Integrated Transport Unit at Hertfordshire County Council. And Alice will provide an overview of Hertfordshire's newly launched DRT scheme called Hertz Links. This scheme was taken from concept to curbside within 6 months of receiving the funding from the DfT, funded under the Rural Mobility Fund, and it's currently operating in North and East Herts. So yeah, over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It's really exciting to talk to you all about our new DRT scheme. So yeah, as mentioned, in March, Hertfordshire County Council received 1.4 million in funding from the DfT's Rural Mobility Fund, and 6 to 7 months later, we've launched Hertz Links. Our successful bid has allowed us to implement a DRT scheme within the service zone, which should be pictured on the side there for you. Our service design has been split into 2 parts. So the first zone is what we call a free floating zone. That's the green area on the map there. This zone centres around Buntingford and the surrounding rural villages. There are over 230 pickup points from which a passenger is able to travel to and from. And the passenger will be required to walk to the virtual bus stop, but they will be guided to this point by the passenger app. In addition to the free floating DRT zone, passengers are also able to book to any of the 6 key hubs, which are Royston, Baldock, Letchworth, Hitchin, Stevenage, and Bishop Stortford, and they're shown in the purple circles on the map as well. However, the difference is journeys booked to these key hubs are limited to specific fixed destinations. So for this part of the design, we have chosen a very small number of pickup points, such as hospitals, train stations, or high streets. The rationale behind this model is that there's already sufficient public transport networks within these key hub towns. So Hertz Links will provide transport from the rural areas to the key hubs, where the passenger can continue their journey on public transport if needed. The other thing to mention as well is that intra-hub travel is not permitted. So, for example, a passenger wouldn't be able to travel between multiple pickup points within one key hub. So our Hertz Link service is currently operating between 7 and 7 on Mondays to Saturdays, and we're running a reduced service on Sundays and bank holidays, which is 10 till 4. And this substantially is improving both the range and the choice of destinations available to residents in the area. These operational times may be expanded if demand is to increase throughout the duration of the scheme, and this demand will be measured by customer feedback and surveys. And then just to add as well that due to COVID-19 and the impact on public transport, we made the decision to reduce the initial number of vehicles to 3, but we will be increasing the vehicle fleet up to 5 in the next year, and then for the rest of the scheme. Can I have the next slide, please? Perfect. So the key aims for Rdrt. The Hertz Link service directly addresses the challenges faced by transport disadvantaged groups evaluated in previous county and local plans. The social exclusion of people living in rural areas who have limited or no access to private cars or public transport is a key issue identified in HCC's local transport plan. Likewise, Hertfordshire's rural transport plan found that most of the DRT focus of rural and North Herts faces accessibility issues that prevent socially disadvantaged residents from reaching employment, education, healthcare and shopping. Hertz Links enhances the opportunities in the scheme area by providing easily accessible transport both within the scheme zone and the 6 key town hubs. Hearts Links will offer passengers shorter wait times, shorter walking distances to pick-up locations, shorter average journey times to key destinations, and these outcomes are closely linked with the Council's strategic objectives of reducing congestion, growing public transport patronage, and improving rural accessibility. Next slide, please. Perfect. So phase one of our service design, we wanted to procure the operator for our scheme and the technology provider separately. And just to add that our operator for Hearts Links is Uno. We have been working closely with our DRT technology provider, which is Padam Mobility, to design the service for Hearts Links. And as previously mentioned, this entails a free floating zone and 6 key town hubs. It was essential that we were able to offer multiple booking platforms. So not just a passenger app, but also a booking website and a dedicated call centre to take bookings over the phone. Whilst it is preferable for passengers to book on the app, it's also important to make sure that the service is accessible to all demographics within the service zone. HCC has also taken the decision to permit the use of concessionary passes and saver cards on the Hearts Links service as well. So the next phase, now that the service is launched, is looking into how we can layer aspects with adult care services and children's services, providing home to school transport or transport to day services or respite care. We're also going to look into engaging with larger sports clubs within the service zone to help increase weekend patronage. And it's also possible that the operational hours may increase later into the evening with the next phase of Hearts Links as well. I think the key thing to highlight really is that the service design isn't static. So the design of the service will naturally change as it aligns with the changing demand. Hence why there is a heavy reliance on the data suites and the analysing of this data. Next slide, please. Lovely. Yes, so it was key for us to ensure that the vehicles that we purchased for Hearts Links were of a very high specification. We had purchased the Mercedes Sprinter low floor conversions from EVM Limited, and these vehicles have a seating capacity of 16 plus 1 wheelchair space, which is accessible by a side ramp. All of our fleet have free Wi-Fi, USB charging ports for every seat, and high standard seating to make the journeys enjoyable for the passengers and to align with the sleek branding of our service. We as a council have devised a robust marketing plan for Hearts Links. We created an animation video which explains how Hearts Links operates. This video has actually had a really enormous response. We've had 78,000 views on YouTube and 55,000 views on Facebook. And I have actually put the link to the video on this slide, which you can look at once the slides have been circulated. Prior to the launch, the vehicles were taken to each of the key town hubs for members of the public to view and engage with the project team about how the scheme would benefit residents and their visitors. And there was a great response to the vehicles from the residents, which was really nice to see. Multiple other platforms of marketing that we have used: leaflets, social media advertising, local newsletters and articles. And there will be ongoing marketing campaigns throughout the duration of the scheme to aid the growth of patronage. We're also reviewing our next steps for marketing just to keep up the momentum with the scheme. For example, we will be creating a designated social media channel for Hearts Links, so we can really create a unique identity for the service with regular updates and polls for feedbacks and options for new stops, as well as with some Christmas promotions coming up soon as well. Next slide, please. Lovely. So on Thursday, the 16th of September, we held a VIP press launch to celebrate Hearts Links, at which trade press were able to take photos and hold interviews about what this service will entail. Our executive member Phil Bibby and Stephen Fiddler, who's the co-director of local transport for DfT, kindly gave speeches, and our technology provider Padam gave a demonstration on the passenger app, the booking website and the back office management portal. Next slide, please. Lovely. So I just wanted to share a bit of high-level data with you as well from our first 3 weeks in operation. So we've had 988 app downloads. We've had just about 1,250 account sign-ups, 5,500 trip searches, and with a conversion rate of 14.82, we've had a total of 637 trips so far, which is really positive for the first 3 weeks. As you can see from the bottom left graph, the majority of the bookings have been made via the booking app, which is great to see. However, there is a significant proportion of bookings being taken over the phone through the call centre. We are monitoring these numbers to ensure that the customer journey is meeting our levels of expectation. For example, analysing call wait times, average call length and volume of missed calls. And then the last graph there on the bottom right gives an overview of the customer satisfaction feedback. So the light green indicates 5 stars, purple 4 stars, red 3 stars, and black and dark green are 2 and 1 star ratings. And this data set is particularly important for our analysis, and we will be closely monitoring the customer satisfaction ratings throughout the scheme. But overall, we have been really, thoroughly pleased with this feedback and the uptake on the service as it's launched. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you will see a flow map which highlights the most popular journeys taken on our service so far. There is a current trend of travel from east to west, which is what we predicted. And whilst the majority of the journeys have been between key hub towns initially, we anticipate there will be a higher demand for inter-rural connections as the service grows. Again, we will be monitoring this closely to ensure that we are shaping Hearts Links to meet the demands of the public. The tables at the side of the flow graph, these show the most popular pick-up and drop-off points so far. So as you can see, Buntingford is currently our most popular pick-up location and drop-off location. But as Buntingford is the centre of our operational zone, it probably will remain as one of the most popular destinations. Again, this is a really valuable data set, as we'll be able to closely monitor the trends in travel with East and North Hearts on the Hearts Link service. The 2 graphs at the top of the slide, these show the patronage trends across the week and across the times of day. And what's interesting is that we've already had a really diverse range of passengers using the service. For example, commuters, students going to school and colleges, as well as passengers travelling to medical appointments and using it for leisure purposes as well. And the customer feedback has enabled us to learn where additional pickup points need to be implemented in order for us to truly serve the designated operating area. We have identified 64 additional stops already, which will be hopefully implemented and live by the end of this month. And we will be circulating surveys in the near future to understand any further demand for additional stops, which we can then add to the service as well. Next slide, please. Perfect. So overall, the first weeks of operation for Hearts Links have been really successful. And we do anticipate that with further marketing and service designs, we will be able to grow patronage quickly and grow the Hearts Links service overall. So that was my overview for you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Alice. We have some questions. As things start in the first iteration of your scheme, what are the walking distances to the virtual stops?
So it depends on, we've got more stops in some places than others, just depending on how many people actually live there. But we did try to make sure that everybody was in a certain, I think it's under 1,000 meters to a stop. Sorry, 100 meters to a stop, yeah.
So does the council have ambitions to expand DRT through the forthcoming bus service improvement plans, such as seeking revenue support to support longer operating hours?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are already looking at, the next stages. So on top of phase 2, what we're going to do at the end of the 4 years, are we going to expand it further? We've had significant demand from the public to expand it into Hertford and Ware, so looking at potentially increasing there, and also we have identified other opportunities for Hearts Links in other areas of the county. So absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. And This is the last question because we need to jump to the other presentations. We are running a few minutes late. So how many unique individuals are behind the trip numbers? For example, in Buntingford, is that a small number of individuals or a large number of single trips? Yeah, not sure if you know that top of your head.
I couldn't answer that off the top of my head because that would all be shown in the statistics. But we are seeing a trend of regular passengers on the vehicle doing the same trips. But I couldn't say off the top of my head what those numbers would be.
Thank you. And yeah, the next presentation is gonna be from VIA. VIA is a DRT app supplier. I believe we have Alex Hunt starting first. I'm not sure, Alex, or is it Jonathan? Not sure. Hi, Alex. We can't hear you, I think. Can you hear me?
Ah, great. Sorry, have I been on mute? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah. If you share your, we can't see your screen though. So, yeah.
I'm trying to work out how to. Here we go. Apologies.
Yep, I can see it. I can see and hear you loud and clear now.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. So, 1 second. Yeah. So, hi everybody, and thank you. Sorry for that slight technical glitch. I'm Alex Hunt, and I'm a partnerships principal at VIA. So, I work with local authorities, transport authorities, and bus operators to develop improved public transport services. We used to be called VIA Van, but thankfully we now have a much simpler name of just VIA. And I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to VIA, who we are and what we do, before getting onto the need for change to the way we provide bus services, and then touch on a few examples of how leading authorities are already going about this. VIA is a public transport technology company with the goal of building the world's most efficient, convenient, and accessible shared mobility solutions. We provide fully integrated solutions to all sorts of public mobility, from demand responsive transport to fixed route bus services, patient and community transport, home to school transport, corporate university shuttles, and so much more. And we integrate all of our partners' shared transport services into the rest of the public transport network to make the services as compelling as possible and ensure that they see the full benefits in terms of modal shift, improved passenger experiences, etc. Our presence here in the UK continues to grow each month, and you'll see we're helping a large number of authorities deliver digital demand responsive transport services across the country. And we'll come back to a couple of interesting case studies later. But now on to the need for change. So looking at the UK, there are some really big challenges facing public transport, and in particular bus services right now. Bus patronage has been in steady decline for a number of years, expedited now to an extent by the cuts to local authority funding for these services. And of course, the pandemic has made these challenges all the more difficult, with rural bus services often among the hardest hit. So getting patronage back to those pre-pandemic levels and then reversing the decline from the past 10 years will be an enormous challenge, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware. But sadly, it's a challenge that we can't afford to not rise to. Whether it's levelling up and access to local services and jobs, or the climate emergency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, public transport really is central to many of our biggest policy challenges, so we really need to get it right. This map from the Financial Times earlier this year shows how much easier it is to access vaccine centres by car than public transport in most parts of the country. This obviously poses a challenge for the vaccination effort, but also shows how difficult it is to access local jobs, services, and community activities for anyone who doesn't have a car and doesn't live in one of England's large metropolitan areas. These things are all core to the government's levelling up agenda, and improving bus services will therefore be pivotal to achieving this. The climate emergency is sadly another challenge that can't be ignored. And this chart shows how big a contribution transport will need to make if we are to successfully reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2050. Whatever comes out of COP26 in Glasgow later this month, and I've no doubt there will be many snazzy headlines around electrification and EVs, it's clear that we're going to need to get people out of private cars and into shared transport if we are to make a meaningful reduction to the UK's carbon emissions. So the question is building the public transport network back to how it was before going to deliver the big and important changes we need to see across our country, or do we need to do public transport differently to meet some of the major challenges of the day? I think it's clear that we do have to have a major rethink about how we provide public transport to better serve the British people and also meet the ambitious goals of levelling up and cutting greenhouse gas emissions. As James was saying earlier before the break, there are sadly no silver bullets in public transport, and we do need a mix of lots of different types of services. One of the tools, of course, which is why we're all here today, that can really help build back a more flexible, dynamic, and efficient public transport network is digital demand responsive transport. It's been really great to listen to so many examples of where this has been trialled and launched across the country, and I'll briefly share with you 2 case studies that highlight how innovative authorities are already using DDRT to tackle these challenges in different parts of the UK. So the first is up in Tees Valley, where lots of rural communities in recent years had actually become cut off from the rest of their communities altogether after the removal of unviable bus services, or the stripping back and reduction of these services to maybe once a day or even just a couple of times a week. When the Mayor Ben Houchen was first elected back 4 years ago, he was determined to reverse some of these trends and fix the problem about social isolation in these rural communities, and launched TeesFlex, a 9-vehicle on-demand bus service that can be accessed via the TeesFlex app or by phone. So TeesFlex serves 3 distinct regions. One is Darlington and Stockton, the other is Hartlepool, and the third is Redcar and Cleveland. And people from these communities now have a much more efficient, much more compelling way of accessing healthcare services, social services, jobs, all these different things that are really core to the levelling up agenda. The service has been really popular with passengers. As you can see, it's all the journeys have an average rating of 4.9 out of 5 stars. There have been 50,000 trips taken just this year alone, and just 6 months after the service was launched, it was actually expanded, given the popularity among local residents, to serve other areas. So it's fair to say that Ben Houchen, the Tees Valley Mayor, has been really happy with this service and really seeing it as a way of providing a much more compelling and efficient bus service, where previously they hadn't been able to do so in this particular part of the Northeast, and is really making a big difference in the Tees Valley. Another area where they're using DRT is over in Wales with the new Flexi DRT service. And basically, when the pandemic hit, Transport for Wales realised that many of the regular bus services were no longer providing an efficient service in lots of parts of the country. So they launched Flexi, a nationwide demand responsive bus service, back in May of last year, which now operates in 11 different areas across Wales. Flexi is accessible via the Flexi app, or you can book online, and you can also book over the phone. And depending on the different areas, it can serve some urban areas like Newport and Cardiff, and it can also serve rural areas like Pembrokeshire and Snowdonia. They've even got a few services kind of on the hinterlands of Newport in Blaenau Gwent, which are serving specifically shift workers needing to travel at, I guess, unsociable times that there aren't already regular bus services able to serve their needs and travel patterns. And Transport for Wales really has this platform now through Flexi that they can offer out to all the local authorities around Wales who have the opportunity to provide new and improved bus service in a very customised and bespoke way, depending on whatever their challenges might be and whatever improvements they might be able to see. So as you can tell, it started off just with one service back in May, but it's really grown to quite a lot of services, again, because the passengers have really rated the service so highly. You saw what that growth was in the first 5 weeks, about 150%, and now it's doing about 32,000 trips just over the last 3 months alone. So the passengers across Wales have been really happy with it, as have Transport for Wales and the local authorities who provide the services. If we look at some of the passenger survey results, we can see that these are also very encouraging in terms of how the service has been taken up. So 89% of passengers say that they would recommend it to a friend, and only 11% of passengers actually preferred the existing bus service that was in place before Flexi came along. Very much like what Becky saw in the services in London, there's actually a very high uptake amongst the older generation. And whilst some people think that, okay, the older generation, maybe the Freedom Pass holders, aren't going to find it as easy to use an app or even the telephone to book their services, what we see is that actually they rated the service the highest in terms of how easy it was to use, and also in terms of satisfaction and how happy they were with the service. So kind of busting that popular myth that is out there, that DRT provided through apps is really only for the younger demographic and the younger generations. The other thing that's really great to see is the impact on modal shift. So 9% of passengers who actually use the Flexi service now had never before used the regular bus services. So this type of DRT, obviously all very customized to whatever the local challenges and needs are, you're seeing is actually bringing a whole new demographic of passengers into the public transport network out of their own private vehicles. And then that's obviously backed up with passengers who do have their own cars, 73% of whom report that they now actually drive less because of the existence of the Flexi service in their local area. So hopefully these numbers are informative. Obviously that story at the top, you can provide all the statistics you want, but often public transport is really about how are you changing and improving the lives of the people you're serving. And you'll see by just being able to provide a slightly more flexible, slightly more demand responsive bus service, a lot of individual people really have just had their livelihoods reinvigorated. And this is something that they've seen both in Wales with Flexi and also in the Tees Valley with Tees Flex. So hopefully that's been helpful and informative. I'll hold it there, but if there are any other questions, feel free to get in touch with me later on. You'll see my email address there on the last slide of the presentation, but happy to take any questions there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I just wanted to just hone in on something or focus on something that you mentioned, and perhaps we could just spend a couple of minutes discussing this. You mentioned the leveling up agenda, and I also perceive it as that the DRT is perhaps a tool in our disposal for advancing the leveling up agenda. So perhaps can you just comment a bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you're seeing with Transport for Wales, once you have that tool, it can be deployed kind of however you want and in lots of different ways. So if the challenge is really providing access to jobs, maybe there are a couple of large factories that don't have public transport access, the whole service can be set up and geared towards that, maybe providing discounted journeys to certain areas, or maybe partnering with certain businesses or local authorities to provide discounted trips to certain locations. So I'd say that's one of the big things. You can also give priority to certain healthcare facilities. So if someone is booking a trip to get to their GP, then they absolutely can't be taken late and they can't be deprioritized. But maybe someone who does just want to go to the shops can be. So quite a lot of different things that all play into the leveling up agenda that really help to stimulate economic activity, help to promote healthcare in the communities where these services operate, and overall strengthen and enhance the rest of the public transport network that already exists in the area, to make sure that everybody in the region is getting access to the jobs, the healthcare, and the social opportunities that they ought to.
Thank you, Alex. And One question from the audience: do you have any evidence that DRT is more successful at attracting people out of their cars than standard bus, or is most usage still subtracted from existing public transport?
This is a great question, because obviously the modal shift that everyone wants is modal shift from private forms of mobility, so cars and taxis, into shared transport rather than regular buses into DRT. What I'd say is yes, there is evidence, and let me just, I think I've already touched on this point, but 73% of passengers, so everywhere where flexi services were launched, there were already existing bus services. So the fact that new passengers are being brought into the network that never before used the bus service, and then all those passengers who already own cars are now driving less, is great evidence of that. One other thing that we're able to do, and it's something that Transport for Wales does in Newport, where they've actually got 9 vehicles providing journeys that the regular bus service can't, is integrate the rest of the regular bus network into the app. And then the app can make the distinction when a passenger books a journey from A to B. It looks at, could this be efficiently served by the regular bus network? And if it can, then a DRT option is not shown to that passenger, just a regular bus option is shown to that passenger. And that's a way of making sure that you actually get zero cannibalization of the existing public transport network, instead saving all of those DRT buses just to provide the journeys that couldn't otherwise be provided by bus services, and making sure that 100% of the modal shift that you get is out of those private cars and forms of mobility into the DRT buses.
Thank you, Alex. And just one comment also from me, and then I'll just jump onto the last question from the audience. So one thing that I have repeatedly picked up the last year in the DRT industry is that the perceptions around the elder generations and technology, I think those perceptions are breaking down now. And especially in the last couple of years, all the DRT schemes, or the assessments of, they showed that, you know, elderly, they didn't have much issues using the app. So I just wanted to highlight that. And also the last question is, how can we put a financial value to the improved accessibility that DRT can provide? Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or whether VIA can, or VIA as a company can provide services around that. Because I know that consultants might be able to provide an answer to this, but I don't know, from your point of view or VIA's point of view, is there a way to put a financial value?
Well, that's the kind of magic, I guess, million-dollar question. I guess when you think about these services and quantifying them, you can look at it from a perspective of, okay, with the subsidy that we're providing to a bus service, is it more efficient for that bus service to be DRT or a regular bus service just on a per passenger basis? But then there's another question of, okay, but by providing a DRT service, how many more opportunities are we providing to be able to access certain areas, and what are the extended benefits of that? And I know that there's, as you said, lots of ways that consultants will say, actually, being able to provide better accessibility to this hospital will equal X number of reduced missed hospital appointments, which come in at £5,000 a pop. There will also be other kind of metrics of, okay, well, obviously, if people are able to have easier access to healthcare, then they're far less likely to have a larger problem down the line, which will be more expensive to deal with. So there's lots of different ways that you can get into the economics to actually work out the wider benefits of the accessibility, but it is certainly very tangible, and certainly something that should be taken into account when thinking about the business case of, you know, how do you provide the most accessible service possible? And it may be in some areas that it's DRT, it may be in some areas that it's another type of transport, but you really do need to think about it holistically.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, so we are running about 10 minutes late. I didn't want to interrupt anyone because we got a lot of great questions. So proceeding now to the next presentation, and the next presentation is by Alex Shapland, who is the co-founder and CEO
Thanks, Stelios. I will assume you can see my screen, but wave if not, Stelios. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a bit about our business, Tandem, and we are building a DRT system, service or a set of services, but it is completely different from most of the kind of services that you've been hearing about so far. We're not just another provider of software delivering the same kind of services. So some things will be familiar. So passengers do book most of their journeys through a smartphone app. There's also the option for telephone booking as well. Again, something familiar. This is familiar as well. Passengers are then pooled together with others traveling the same way at the same time. Again, so far so familiar. But the thing that's completely unique about our service is that they are delivered by a completely flexible fleet. So rather than having dedicated minibuses that are driving around all day, every day, regardless of how many people are using the service, our services are delivered by existing local transport providers. So that might be existing private hire and taxi companies, it could be minibus companies or coach companies. And with the taxis in particular, that introduces a whole level of flexibility that otherwise wouldn't be there. So if, for example, 3 passengers book, we can dispatch a local 4-seater taxi. If 5 or 6 passengers book at a particular moment, we can send a 6-seater taxi. If 7 or 8, we can send an 8-seater taxi, etc. But crucially, again, particularly where we're looking at more rural areas, if nobody books at a particular moment, which would be quite common in some kind of geographies, then at that moment, we don't make a booking at all. So these aren't block bookings, we're kind of booking as we go with these local providers. And so if nobody books, we don't dispatch a vehicle at all and no cost is incurred. So rather than having a driver kind of driving around waiting to pick somebody up, there are there's no vehicles being dispatched unless they're needed. So that's savings on both costs and emissions. So a quick case study for you. So we too are working with Transport for the West Midlands, as Via colleagues just shared. So interestingly, they've got a big service around the University of Warwick, but about 30 minutes drive south of the main campus is a satellite campus called Wellesbourne. I think it's a former agricultural college. It's in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Historically, the fixed route service was both economically challenging because throughout most of the day there weren't people travelling, and it was poor quality service for passengers as well because it was a once-an-hour departure, and so problematic all round. But it's also not particularly well. There was a question mark in TfWM's minds as to whether it would be well served by the DRT service that is surrounding the main campus. Because it's so far out of that main zone, it's 13 miles away from the edge of that zone, let alone the kind of heart of the zone, that would increase the costs. It also means that you're having to pull vehicles away just to maybe pick up 1 or 2 passengers down from this satellite campus. And so you end up with a suboptimal experience, both for the people in the main zone, but also people at Wellesbourne who may have huge variation in their wait times. And so what we've done is partner with an existing local taxi company, Taxi United Warwick, who are based in Leamington Spa. And our services, again, this is obviously very different from most of the DRT services that we've been hearing about, operates on what we call a dynamic schedule. So there are potential departures every 20 minutes. So you have a bit of a timetable, a bit like with a traditional bus service. But crucially, again, the vehicles are only dispatched as and when they're needed. So if 3 passengers book onto the 8:20 departure, we send a 4-seater taxi. If on the 8:40 nobody books, and this is obviously the case for good chunks of the day, given the nature of the demand locally, we're not sending vehicles and therefore saving on costs and emissions, while still being able to provide a really high frequency service for those passengers that are booking. So as you can see, it's really quite a different model from most of the others we've been hearing about today. So overall, we've moved from what was a historically hourly fixed route service. So we now are offering journeys that are, or potential departures that are 3 times as frequent, 3 journeys an hour. There's a cost saving because they're not paying for a minibus all day to drive back and forth, regardless of how many people are using it. And there's also reduced emissions because, again, vehicles are only being dispatched as and when they're needed. So in this particular use case, it seems to be a really good fit. So the kind of use cases that we've been focused on so far, and we've had a particular focus on out of town employment sites, where again, there may be particular times of day where 6 o'clock in the morning, where lots of people need to get to a shift, and 2 o'clock when they're coming home, but the rest of the day, there isn't that same demand. And so the ability to introduce the service when it's needed, but not pay for it when it isn't, can be really important. Another is new housing developments. So one of the things that we hear a lot about new housing developments is that local authorities want to put in a really high quality service from day one, because otherwise people end up buying being forced into buying their own car. But it's very expensive to put in place a high quality service from day one, because obviously the patronage in the early days of a housing development would mean low passenger numbers, and so what does this mean? Forgive me. And so our services allow a local authority to put in place the equivalent of a high quality fixed route service from day one, but only pay for that service as and when it's needed. So our service, one of the things I should reiterate is that our services operate on a pay-as-you-go basis. So there aren't large upfront costs of leasing and procuring vehicles. There aren't huge annual subsidy or subscription costs, for big pieces of software. Our services operate on a purely pay-as-you-go basis. So journeys that are required are paid for, obviously, as we go. But if the service isn't being used, actually there's no cost at all. So there's also a real opportunity to trial services and potentially increase your network into new rural areas, either as kind of feeder services into the existing network, or filling gaps within the existing network too. So our services work best in places where this kind of pay-as-you-go and flexibility adds huge value. So our services, as I mentioned, work a bit like a fixed route bus, which means that you have, I guess there's some pros and cons. So you don't have the immediate potential that a bus could be with you in 5 minutes, but what you do have is guaranteed departure times. Again, I get it a bit like some of the advantages of the traditional fixed route service. So if you book a journey for 8:40 in the morning, the vehicle will be with you at 8:40. There's no way of getting a journey at 8:50, say, on that Warwick service, because they're every 20 minutes. But unlike some of the other services where your departure time can vary hugely day to day. 1 minute, one day you press the app and the wait will be 5 minutes. The next day you press it and it'll be 25 minutes. With services like tandems, actually the departure times are effectively guaranteed. This means that we don't operate in the kind of zonal approach. So our services operate on kind of semi-fixed routes to avoid the risk of just subsidizing taxi journeys for people. And then one of the other requirements would be that we need a kind of small to medium-sized taxi firm not too far away. So there needs to be a kind of small to medium-sized town, not a million miles away from the rural area that we might be serving. And then my final slide is the phrase horses for courses. So we strongly believe that there is still an important role for fixed route bus services to play. We strongly also believe that there are geographies where standard DRT models are the right fit, as VIA and others advocate for. But we think there's a kind of another set of geographies where a model like ours, with a uniquely flexible approach to the fleet delivery, will be the best model. And we're increasingly looking at whether there are different blends that we can propose as well. So, for example, we're talking to some local authorities about the idea that we're kind of effectively extending the hours of their fixed route service. So between 7 and 7, it will be the same fixed route service that they've had in place for a long time, but they want to then extend that into the evening where the patronage might be lower, and that's where the advantage of our kind of flexible fleet really comes into its own. Happy to have more conversation with people afterwards. My contact details are there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We have a few questions. So this question came up a couple of times. Similar question is, how do you ensure that there is taxi availability and you can meet the demand? Because presumably the fleet of the pool of cars available are not dedicated to the DRT scheme.
That's right. So it depends a bit on the geography. So we're looking at a service for the University of Cambridge, actually, where the taxi company locally is so large that there are no times a day where they can't guarantee us a vehicle, and we enter into an agreement that means that they will guarantee us a vehicle with 8 minutes notice at any time of day. Fantastic. In other geographies, obviously perhaps smaller towns or even more deep rural areas, it may be that actually during, for example, the school run in the morning and the afternoon, actually we do need to introduce a slight level of of kind of reduced flexibility into it, i.e. we would block book a vehicle for the school run in the afternoon and the school run in the morning. So obviously that would introduce a layer of fixed cost, but you retain the flexibility throughout the rest of the day when the taxi companies have more availability, basically.
Great. And next question is, do you use differential pricing based upon passenger numbers, or generally just differential pricing? It's a very interesting question. I know that some DRT suppliers either attempted that in the past, some of them still do it. I guess it also depends on the locality, the city, even the country sometimes, or the legislative environment. But as Right Tandem, have you ever attempted to use differential pricing?
At the moment, no. And part of the reason for that is the majority of our services to date have been focused on taking workers like the dads you mentioned that inspired the business to relatively low income roles in out of town employment sites. And we think it's really important for those kind of passengers to be able to rely on the price being the same every day, regardless of how many other people need it. So yeah, we kind of have a philosophical leaning towards fixed pricing so that people can budget around it, but we're open potentially to piloting that in the future if there was the demand for it.
Thank you. And last question because we have obviously overrun by 8 minutes. How do your fares work? And generally, is it per mile? Is it how is your structure set? And is the service registered with the traffic commissioner? Because Right Tandem is, it's a DRT with a difference, let's say.
Yeah. So the fares are set ultimately in partnership with. So the pricing of the service is set by the local in negotiation with the local taxi providers. So that is the overall cost base, and then the price per passenger is then set by whoever we're kind of delivering this service for. So in the case of a local authority, ultimately the local authority choose how much to charge for each seat on board the vehicle. In terms of licensing and registration side of things, where we're operating these services with taxis, actually the services in general are registered as private hire services. So there is an exemption to the Transport Act, I think section 11.2. Happy to chat, send a link to people afterwards if they're interested, which means that actually we don't need to register those kind of services with the traffic commissioner, but we would be open to registering using special restricted operators licenses if people would prefer that method, and then obviously we would be then registering as suggested.
Many thanks, Alex, and many thanks to all the speakers today. I'll draw the event to a close. I'm gonna liaise with all the speakers and CIHT and ATCO to see where we can host the presentations and the recording if it's possible, and we will have we can send an email to all the attendees who registered to attend the event, and see how we can share the presentations. So thank you very much for joining. And if you have any other questions or suggestions, either around DRT or the CIHT or ATCO, by all means get in touch with the email address that was on the invite, or by all means reach out to myself or James. And yeah, we are hoping to have another DRT-related event perhaps in January. It's going to be perhaps a more focused event. It's still in development, and we'll let you know. Thank you very much.